I was born in a place that looked like it had leaped out of a fairy tale, the Swat Valley, nestled in the mountains of northern Pakistan. With snow-capped peaks rising into the sky, lush green hills blanketed with pine forests, and rivers that glistened under the sun. It was often called the Switzerland of the East. But to me, it wasn't just a scenic postcard. It was home familiar, warm, alive with the sound of roosters at dawn and the murmur of markets in the evening. Swat was the world where I laughed, dreamed, and grew. In our culture, Pashtun culture tradition ran deep. Boys were celebrated as blessings, and girls were often seen as burdens. But my father didn't see the world that way. When I was born, instead of lamenting for not having a son, he named me after Malala of Maiwan, a brave Pashtun heroine who rallied warriors during battle. Malala, he would whisper to me, "You are not like other girls. You will speak, you will shine, you will lead." Even as a child, I felt the fire of curiosity burning inside me. I devoured books, I argued passionately in class, and I competed with boys without fear. My father ran a school, and I grew up among chalkboards and lesson plans, peeking into classrooms long before I could write my own name. Education, to me, wasn't just a duty, it was magic. It opened up worlds I'd never seen, introduced me to ideas I had never imagined. I believed that every girl, just like every boy, had the right to hold that magic in her hands. But outside the walls of our school, the world was beginning to shift. The sound of birdsong was being replaced by radio broadcasts filled with hate. Whispers of fear began to spread in the markets. A darkness was creeping into our paradise, slow, silent, and deadly. Still, I was just a girl who loved school, told stories to my brothers, and dreamed of becoming a doctor. I didn't know that one day, simply holding a book could become a dangerous act. I didn't know that speaking up for my right to learn would make me a target. All I knew was that I wanted to learn, and I would not be silent. My father, Malala Yousafzai, was not a rich man, not a politician, not a warrior, but in my eyes, he was one of the bravest men I would ever know. He stood up when others remained seated. He spoke out when others were silent. In our conservative community, where traditions ran deeper than rivers, and where questioning them often meant social exile, or worse, my father opened a school, a beacon of light in the fog of ignorance. The Kushal School, named after a famous Pashtun poet, became a place where boys and girls sat side by side, learning not only how to read and write, but how to think, how to question, how to dream. Every morning, I watched my father prepare for another battle, not with weapons, but with words. His speeches on education, women's rights, and justice echoed through classrooms, local gatherings, and radio shows. I watched him walk into government offices with worn shoes but unwavering principles. He had a stammer, and people often mocked him for it when he was younger, but I never once saw him hesitate when it came to speaking the truth. He believed that one voice, even one as trembling as his once was, could shake mountains if it spoke with conviction. From him, I learned that courage is not the absence of fear, it is the decision to act in spite of it. He never forced me to be brave, but his example made it impossible for me not to try. When he stood tall in a room full of men who disagreed with him, I saw what it meant to have integrity. When he defended a girl's right to attend school, even while others told him it would bring shame to our family, I saw what it meant to have a spine made of iron. He wasn't just my father. He was the architect of the values I would one day carry to the world. Even though he faced threats from extremists, even though money was tight, and political tensions grew thicker every month, he refused to close the school. "Malala," he told me one night when I asked him if he was afraid, "when the whole world is silent, even one voice becomes powerful." I didn't understand the full weight of those words then, but they settled deep into my bones. I started to realize that our little school, a modest building with a tin roof and creaky desks, was more than just a place of learning. It was resistance. It was revolution. And my father, fear. At first, people were curious. Then, they were captivated. Slowly, the community began to shift. Shopkeepers played his sermons. Neighbors nodded in agreement. Even family friends repeated his words as if they were sacred scripture. Faslala's voice, once a background noise, became a storm. He claimed that girls going to school was a sin, that modern education was poison, that the West was trying to corrupt Islam. And with every broadcast, his influence grew. Armed men began appearing in our streets, the Taliban, enforcing rules that weren't written by our government, but by fear itself. Music was banned, CDs were burned, women were told to stay home. Those who disobeyed were beaten, or worse. I was just a young girl, but I understood the danger. I remember the first time I saw a schoolgirl's uniform burning in a pile of flames, lit by men who said it was harem. I remember looking at my own uniform, folded neatly under my pillow, wondering if it would be next. But still, I put it on every morning. I refused to let the darkness take away the one thing I loved most, my education. At home, the fear seeped in. My mother worried constantly. My father received threats, slipped under the school door, or whispered to him at market. But he didn't bend. Instead, he began speaking out even louder, denouncing the Taliban on local TV, writing newspaper columns, organizing community meetings. And then he did something I never expected. He encouraged me to speak out too. I started writing a diary under a pseudonym for the BBC Urdu service. I was just 11 years old, chronicling my daily life under Taliban rule. I wrote about the fear, the silence in the classrooms, the bombs, the growing emptiness of our once busy school hallways. It felt strange, powerful, and dangerous at once to put my thoughts into words that others might read. But I did it because I believed, like my father, that silence was not an option. And so, even as the shadow grew, as friends moved away, as schools were shut, as the streets became quieter and darker, my voice grew louder. I was scared, of course. I was only a child. But I also understood that fear cannot be allowed to win, not if we wanted a different future. As the months passed, my voice, once a whisper, started reaching ears far beyond the Swat Valley. International media began to take notice of the anonymous girl writing under the name Gul Makai, who described what life was like for a child under Taliban rule. I had never imagined that my diary would travel so far, but with each entry, more people began to care. Reporters reached out, interviews followed. Eventually, I stepped out of the shadows and revealed that I was the one behind the words. My name was no longer hidden. I was Malala Yousafzai. Some people in my village called me brave. Others said I was foolish. But I didn't want fame or attention. I wanted one thing: to go to school without fear. That desire, so simple and pure, became controversial in a land where girls were told to be silent. My classmates and I knew we were taking a risk. We wore our uniforms like armor, walked to school like soldiers. We studied even when we heard gunshots outside. Each notebook, each lesson, each page turned became an act of defiance. But the Taliban were listening and watching. By now, they controlled much of the valley. Their warnings turned into attacks. Schools were bombed. Girls were threatened. Then, one day in October 2012, they came for me. I was just 15 years old. It was an ordinary school day. I sat on the school bus, chatting with friends about exams and books. Laughter filled the air. But then, in an instant, everything changed. The bus stopped. A masked man climbed aboard and asked one chilling question. Who is Malala? No one answered. The silence was heavy, but he already knew. The gun fired. Once, twice, 3 times. One bullet entered the left side of my head. My world went dark. What followed was a blur of pain, surgery, and survival. I was flown to a military hospital in Pakistan, then eventually transferred to Birmingham, England, where doctors performed multiple surgeries to save my life. My skull was fractured, my eardrum shattered, my face paralyzed on one side. But I survived, against all odds. I woke up in a foreign hospital, far from the mountains and rivers of my home. And when I opened my eyes, I realized something profound. They tried to silence me, but they only amplified my voice. Waking up in a hospital in Birmingham was like waking up in a different universe. The air smelled different. The walls were unfamiliar. My family was not by my side. For days, I could not speak. Not because I didn't want to, but because the bullet had paralyzed half my face. My mouth drooped. My hearing was gone in one ear. My voice, the very thing that had become my power, had been stripped from me. But I was alive. Slowly, with the help of doctors and therapists, I began to heal. At first, I focused on small things, sitting up, brushing my hair, trying to smile again. Then, I began to speak. Each word was painful, but also triumphant. I had survived not just a bullet, but an attempt to erase me, to scare every girl who had ever dared to dream of going to school. When I was strong enough, my family joined me in the UK. I remember seeing my mother walk into the hospital room, her eyes filled with tears, her hands trembling as she touched my face. My father, who had fought so hard for my education, held my hand and whispered, "Malala, you are stronger than fear." That moment stays with me even now. News of the attack spread worldwide. Leaders, celebrities, and ordinary people expressed outrage and solidarity. But what mattered most to me were the letters, thousands of them, from children around the world. They told me they had read my story. They told me they would stand with me. And they asked what they could do. That's when I realized my voice was no longer just mine. From that hospital bed, I made a decision. I would not let my story end there. I would not let that bullet define me. If the Taliban feared education, then I would dedicate my life to spreading it. If they tried to silence me, then I would speak even louder. So I began to travel. I spoke at the United Nations on my 16th birthday, telling the world, one child, one teacher, one book, one pen can change the world. I met presidents, prime ministers, refugees, and students. I co-founded the Malala Fund to support girls' education in some of the most difficult parts of the world. I became the youngest person ever to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. But none of it was for fame. It was for the girls who still couldn't go to school, for the children who still lived in fear, for the voices that were still being silenced. I was just one girl from a remote valley in Pakistan, but I had learned the most powerful truth of all. When the world is dark, even a single voice can be the spark that lights it again. Before the bullets, before the speeches, before the world knew my name, I was just a little girl who loved books, laughter, and mountains. My early childhood in the Swat Valley was not defined by violence. It was colored with joy. I grew up surrounded by stories, not just the ones in books, but the ones passed down through generations. Tales of fairies, of courage, of kings and queens who stood for justice. These stories shaped the girl I would become. My father, Zaodin, was my hero. He wasn't rich or powerful, but he had something far greater, a burning belief in equality. In a country where sons were celebrated and daughters were often hidden behind veils of silence, my father proudly declared my birth. He registered my name. He told everyone, "This child will do great things." He named me after Malala Yousafzai, the greatest female warrior in Afghan history, a girl who stood in the face of death and rallied men to victory with her voice. I often wondered, did he know what he was preparing me for? Our home was modest, but filled with dreams. I shared a room with my brothers. We played cricket in the narrow alleyways, raced across rooftops, and giggled under candlelight when the electricity went out. My mother, a deeply kind and spiritual woman, taught me love, sacrifice, and faith. We weren't rich, but we were rich in values. School, for me, was heaven. I remember the feeling of slipping into my uniform each morning, clutching my school bag, walking the bumpy roads to the Kushal school, the one my father had founded. It was not a fancy building. The walls were bare. The benches were hard. But for me, it was a palace of possibilities. I loved learning. Math confused me sometimes, but Urdu poetry, that made my soul dance. But even in those early days, the world outside was shifting. A cloud was creeping into our valley, and we children wrapped in dreams were unaware of the storm brewing just beyond the mountains. The Swat Valley, once known for its beauty, rivers, and peaceful culture, began to change before our eyes. At first, The change was slow, almost invisible. A new voice came on the radio. Malala Yousafzai, a radical cleric who spoke with fire in his words. He used religion not to inspire, but to control. At first, people listened out of curiosity, then out of fear. Slowly, his words started to shape minds, especially those who were desperate or poor. He said girls shouldn't go to school, that education was un-Islamic, that women should stay hidden, that music was sinful, that the modern world had poisoned our faith. For many, this voice became law, even though it was not law. Taliban fighters moved into our valley. They arrived like ghosts in the night, their faces covered, their rifles ready. They weren't from SWAT. They didn't speak our dialect, but they came with threats and punishments. They blew up music shops. They banned television. They lashed men in the square for trimming their beards. And then they came for the schools. One by one, girls' schools were shut down. Threats were posted on school gates. Headmasters were warned. Then, bombs were planted. Flames rose from the buildings that once echoed with children's laughter. I remember walking past the rubble of a school and thinking, they are not just destroying buildings, they are destroying dreams. But we were not silent. My father continued to speak out. He gave interviews. He gathered activists. He wrote articles. And I, just a young girl, followed in his footsteps. I began writing a diary for the BBC under the name Gul Makai, describing what it was like to live as a schoolgirl under Taliban threat. I used a fake name to stay safe, but my words were real. I wrote about fear, about hope, about the courage of my friends who still came to class, even when gunfire rang outside. The world began to listen. But the Taliban were listening too. Even as the threat grew closer, I could not, would not, stay silent. The more they tried to scare us, the louder I felt I needed to speak. I was only 11, but my voice had begun to reach far beyond SWAT. I spoke on television interviews. I gave speeches about every child's right to education. Journalists visited our school. Cameras followed me home. People started calling me the girl who fights the Taliban with her words. It felt strange. I didn't feel like a hero. I was just a girl who wanted to go to school. But with every appearance, every interview, I could sense it, the danger tightening around me. Threats against my father intensified. Rumors began to swirl that I was on a Taliban kill list. Friends told me to stop speaking. Even our neighbors started whispering, "She's too bold. It's not safe." At night, I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, asking myself, am I doing the right thing? What if something happens to my family? Because of me, fear crept into my thoughts, but I never let it reach my voice. Education, I believed, was more powerful than any weapon, and the Taliban feared it because they knew educated girls could not be controlled. They wanted to push us into silence, into the shadows. But I had seen what happens when girls are educated. They speak, they think, they rise. I kept writing, I kept learning, I kept showing up to school even when others stayed home. My friends and I clung to our notebooks like shields. My backpack became a symbol of resistance. We were ordinary children caught in extraordinary circumstances. But we had one thing the Taliban didn't: hope. My father would often say, "Let us pick up our books and pens. They are our most powerful weapons." And I believed him, more with each passing day. Then came the day that would change everything. October 9th, 2012, I was riding the school bus, surrounded by friends, laughing about exams and teachers. The road was bumpy. The sun was warm, and then a man stepped in front of the bus. He asked for me by name. The man didn't wait for an answer. He already knew who I was. He raised a gun and fired 3 times. One bullet struck me on the left side of my head, just above my eye. The others injured 2 of my friends. In a single moment, the noise of laughter was replaced with chaos, screams, and silence. I collapsed onto the seat, bleeding, unconscious, my body crumpled, my fate uncertain. News of the attack spread rapidly across Pakistan, and soon around the world. People were shocked that someone would target a child for simply wanting to go to school. My family was devastated. My father wept at my bedside. My mother, unable to speak English, could only pray as I lay unconscious in a hospital bed in Peshawar. The doctors did what they could, but my injuries were too severe for local treatment. I was airlifted to Birmingham, England, where a team of doctors fought to save my life. I was placed in a medically induced coma. My skull had to be partially removed to relieve pressure on my brain. My hearing in one ear was lost. My face was paralyzed on one side. And yet, I lived. When I woke up, I didn't know where I was. I couldn't speak. I couldn't walk. I couldn't understand why my family wasn't by my side. But slowly, I began to recover, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. The pain was great, but the support I received was greater. Cards, letters, gifts poured in from all over the world. People from different countries, faiths, and cultures sent prayers and love. The whole world had become my family. But with that love came responsibility. I had survived for a reason, and I knew that reason was bigger than me. They thought the bullet would silence me. Instead, it gave me a louder voice. I knew, more than ever, that I had to fight, not just for myself, but for every girl who had ever been told, "You don't matter." Surviving the attack wasn't the end of my journey. It was the beginning of a global mission. I was no longer just Malala from Swat Valley. I had become a symbol of resistance, of resilience, and of education as a human right. But it wasn't fame I wanted, it was change. Real change. So with every opportunity, every stage, every headline, I made sure the message stayed the same. One child, one teacher, one book, and one pen can change the world. With the support of my father, we created the Malala Fund, an organization dedicated to ensuring girls everywhere have access to 12 years of free, quality education. We began supporting schools in countries like Nigeria, Syria, India, and Afghanistan. We met with world leaders, challenged outdated policies, and called out systems that failed their children. I spoke at the United Nations on my 16th birthday, wearing a shawl that once belonged to Benazir Bhutto, Pakistan's first female prime minister, and declared that I was stronger than fear, louder than violence. But through it all, I remained a student. In Birmingham, I attended school just like any other teenager. I studied physics, literature, history. I struggled with exams, worried about grades, and laughed with friends during lunch breaks. I wore jeans, loved chocolate, and watched Bollywood movies. The world saw a global activist, but I was also still just a girl, trying to find her place. In 2014, I became the youngest recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize at just 17 years old. I stood on the stage in Oslo, not just representing myself, but every girl who has ever fought to learn. I shared that honor with Kailash Satyarthi, an Indian child rights activist, a reminder that our mission was not bound by borders or religions. But I have never forgotten where I came from. Swat will always be my home. The mountains, the people, the dreams of children still echo in my heart. I often think of my friends who couldn't finish school, the girls who were married too young, the voices still silenced by fear. I speak because they cannot. My name is Malala, and I am proof that one girl, armed with courage and education, can indeed shake the world. From survivor to global symbol. After receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, I felt a deep sense of both gratitude and responsibility. The world now looked at me not just as a victim of violence, but as a global advocate for education and peace. But fame was never my goal. I still saw myself as a daughter, a sister, a student, and above all, a girl from the Swat Valley who simply wanted to go to school. In every speech I gave, every country I visited, I tried to carry the voice of the voiceless girls who still lived under the threat of war, poverty, or oppression. My story had reached millions, but I never forgot that behind the headlines, there were still countless girls whose names would never be known unless we fought for them. Meeting world leaders, asking hard questions over the years, I met with presidents, prime ministers, monarchs, and unofficials. I sat across from men and women with the power to change laws and lives. But I never saw them as above me. I asked questions no one else would dare to ask. Why do you spend more on war than on education? Why are girls still forced into marriage in your country? What are you doing to help refugee children? These questions weren't meant to insult, but to remind people in power of their duty. I was often told I was brave, but I didn't feel brave. I felt determined, because every second we wasted meant another girl's dream delayed. The Malala Fund in action through the Malala Fund. We launched programs in places where girls' education was most at risk, in refugee camps, war-torn regions, and rural villages where schools were miles away. We supported girls' education champions, local leaders, and teachers who knew their communities best. We published research, shared stories, and created documentaries to show the world what was happening on the ground. In northern Nigeria, I met girls who had escaped Boko Haram. In Lebanon, I met Syrian refugees learning in tents. In Kenya, I met girls who walked 2 hours just to attend class. Each of them carried the same spark I once did, a deep hunger to learn, to rise, to break the cycle. Facing criticism, holding firm with visibility came criticism. Some said I was being used by the West, that I had abandoned my culture. Others accused me of being too political, too outspoken. But I knew that silence was never an option. I wasn't fighting against Pakistan or any religion. I was fighting against ignorance, fear, and injustice. I continued to speak with respect, but never with apology. I was careful to remember that real change doesn't come from shouting louder, but from standing stronger. I reminded myself that progress always brings resistance, but that shouldn't stop us from moving forward. A new chapter, Oxford and beyond. Eventually, I achieved something I had long dreamed of, studying at Oxford University in the UK. I was accepted into Lady Margaret Hall, the same college once attended by Benazir Bhutto at Oxford. I studied philosophy, politics, and economics, PPE, a course that allowed me to explore the ideas that shaped the world. It was surreal to sit in lectures alongside students from every corner of the globe, debating justice, ethics, and power. I wasn't just learning for myself, I was preparing to be even more effective in my advocacy. Graduation wasn't an end, but a milestone on a journey that I knew would last my entire life. For years after the attack, I couldn't return home, though I carried the Swat Valley in my heart. Security concerns and political tension kept me away. But in 2018, nearly 6 years after I was shot, I finally went back. The moment I stepped onto Pakistani soil, I felt overwhelmed with emotion. I visited my childhood home, walked the halls of my old school, and hugged the friends I had left behind. I cried as I stood at the foot of the mountains that raised me. It was a bittersweet return. So much had changed, yet the love of the people remained. My journey had taken me around the world, but this return grounded me. It reminded me that while I had become a global advocate, my roots were still deep in that valley, among those people, and in that struggle. As the Malala Fund grew, I made a conscious choice to shift the spotlight from myself to the millions of other girls whose stories needed to be heard. We launched Assembly, a digital publication for girls to share their voices. From Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh to indigenous girls in Brazil, we helped amplify their stories in their own words. I didn't want to be the only face of this fight. I wanted to build a platform where others could stand beside me. I began mentoring young female activists, supporting grassroots movements, and funding new educational programs in fragile states. The goal was never to create a brand, it was to create a movement. I began to spend more time with students, not in large halls or formal speeches, but in intimate classrooms and video calls. I listened more than I spoke. I heard from girls in South Sudan who risked being kidnapped just to go to school, from girls in Yemen who studied by candlelight under the threat of bombs, from transgender students in Brazil, and from girls in the U.S. battling racial inequality in education. Their dreams were bold and brilliant. They wanted to become doctors, engineers, artists, and leaders. And they didn't want pity, they wanted partnership. I realized that the future wasn't something we wait for, It's something we must build together. Despite all the progress we've made, the world was and is still full of challenges. Wars rage on. Climate change threatens communities. Authoritarianism rises. And millions of girls still wake up in a world that tells them they're less than boys. But I've learned that hope is not the absence of hardship, it's the strength to face it. The more difficult the times, the more vital education becomes. Because when we educate a girl, we don't just change her life, we change her family, her community, and her country. We change the future. That belief keeps me going, even on the hardest days. I've seen what's possible when girls are given a chance. I've lived it. Today, I live with more purpose than ever. I write, I speak, I lead. I still read books before bed and dream of new adventures. I get nervous before interviews. I argue with my brothers. I dance in the kitchen with my mom. I'm not perfect, I'm just persistent. And I know this, I will never stop fighting for girls' education. Not until every girl, no matter where she is, how poor she is, or what her faith is, can sit in a classroom and learn without fear. That is my promise. That is my purpose. My name is Malala. I was shot for speaking out, but I survived, and I will keep speaking until no child is left behind. When I reflect on everything that has happened, I often ask myself, why me? Why was I the girl who survived, the girl whose voice reached millions? I believe it's because I dared to speak when silence was the norm. I didn't have an army or a microphone. I had a school uniform and a pen. But I used what I had. And the truth is, every single person has a voice, a story, a strength. What matters is whether we choose to use it. You don't need to be famous to make change. You don't need to be perfect to make a difference. All you need is the courage to begin. I spoke not because I was fearless, but because I feared a world without education, without opportunity, without equality. That fear became fuel, and my voice became a spark. One of the clearest lessons from my life is that education is not just about books, it's about freedom. It's the foundation of peace, of prosperity, of possibility. But for millions of children, especially girls, it remains out of reach. Sometimes because of poverty, sometimes because of war, sometimes because of prejudice, but always because the world hasn't prioritized it. I've seen what happens when a girl is denied education. She's more likely to marry early, suffer abuse, and live in poverty. But I've also seen what happens when she is empowered. She becomes a doctor, a leader, a changemaker. The world changes with her. That's why education is not charity, it's justice. It's not a gift, it's a right. One common misconception about my story is that I had to choose between my religion and my beliefs in women's rights. But that's never been true. I am a Muslim. I say my prayers. I read the Quran. And I also believe in gender equality, freedom, and human dignity. These values, silenced in Afghanistan, abducted in Nigeria, married off in Yemen, and denied access to school in rural communities around the world. Even in wealthy nations, inequalities persist. The COVID-19 pandemic rolled back years of advancement in education, and in some places, authoritarian leaders openly attack women's rights. That's why I keep fighting through policy, through funding, through storytelling. I've learned that advocacy isn't a moment, it's a movement. It takes patience. Anyone who tells you that your gender makes you less, never let fear stop you from standing up. And even if the world tries to quiet you, speak louder. Speak for yourself. Speak for those who cannot. You don't need permission to change the world. You already have everything you need inside you. Just begin. That's what I did. And look how far one voice, your voice, can go.